The two people I want to introduce you to today are Jack and Jill. Chances are you probably know them. Looking at this audience, I can honestly see half the people here definitely are them. They're late-stage millennials, maybe in their late 20s, up to their early 40s, and they live in cities, particularly cities like Boston. They love living in cities. We all live in cities. We all live here. We all love living here. Cities are amazing places. We have access to food, access to culture, museums, street life. We have access to jobs. We're tapped into the innovation economies that take place here. The problem is that the place that they live looks a bit like this. Should be familiar to everyone that lives in the city. Chances are they live in a studio, maybe a one-bedroom if they're lucky, probably have roommates. The problem with this model not only is its size, which is pretty limiting, but also the fact that they're renting. This is a problem because it doesn't allow young people to actually own equity in the city. But more specifically, nobody can access equity in the city. People cannot afford to actually have a space of ownership in the places in which they want to live. All in all, there's more people like them than ever before. Cities are growing. People want to live in these places. They are attracted to the things that are bringing them here. We can see urban populations worldwide increasing exponentially. In 2018, urban population has reached 4.2 billion people. It's a huge number. By 2050, 7 out of 10 of us will be living in cities. And the world is urbanizing at a rapid rate, and our cultures and our economics aren't taking speed. The traditional answer to building equity has always been to just move out to the suburbs. This might have been available to our parents, but it's definitely not available to us. There's been a 10% increase in the median age of first home buying as people are waiting longer to do the things that society has expected of them historically. And it comes at a larger cost than ever before too. Our parents, by and large, in 1975, it only cost them 1.7 times what their yearly income to actually buy a first house. Now, it's 2.5 times. Can you imagine paying this much money when you're already saddled with student debt? No wonder why people are waiting even longer to do this. This is impossible, and this is even worse near cities, the places where people actually want to live. And this is the thing, people do want to live here. They don't want to necessarily go out to the suburbs anymore. They want the spaces that exist here. And so it's important for us to create spaces here that allow for people to build equity. So here we have a housing crisis at multiple levels. This is a failure in slow motion. It's one that we're not paying enough attention to. It's worth noting here that we have to accept that this is affecting the people most disenfranchised amongst us, the most marginalized. Income inequality affects these people even worse than it does the middle class. But there is another thing to acknowledge here too, that the middle class is suffering. There's no space for people, normal people, to live in cities anymore. We can look at pretty much every city in America that points to this problem. We can look at New York City, where spaces are getting privatized at a rate that is unbelievable. There's almost no public space left in New York. And the buildings that are getting built are exclusively for the very wealthy. These are not equitable spaces to live. They're not nice places to live. We can look at San Francisco with the world's worst housing crisis. The level of income inequality in San Francisco is staggering, with some of the largest amounts of homelessness in the entire planet. This is unacceptable in a first world country. And we can look even in our own backyard in Boston. We know this to be true. We all live here. We're struggling to live here. The middle class has no place to live in the city anymore. There's no place to go, and especially no place to build equity. We're trapped in a rental loop for basically our entire lives, and it's putting us in debt. Half of this problem is clearly economic. This is a political and economic issue, and it needs to be tackled on those terms. But I would argue that there's another half here, a cultural half. What are we losing in our cities through these mechanisms? Why aren't we having good places to live? We're having a crisis of community that dovetails almost perfectly with this crisis of economics. We read headlines like this almost every single day. Social isolation, urban ennui, loneliness. These are reaching epidemic and pandemic proportions. This is happening globally in metropolises. Our cities are not serving us emotionally, and I believe that this is deeply tied to the way in which we live. Half of all Americans suffer feelings of isolation and loneliness, some of, if not all of the time. That number is so sad. Half the people in this room feel this way. I feel this way. Everyone feels this way. We know the statistic is true. We feel it. We know it is. And this is true in cities where we live by ourselves or even with roommates, feeling alone and isolated, surrounded by millions of people that are just like us, as lonely as we are. And it happens in the suburbs where we commute to and from work, back to our partners or spouse, but divided from our neighbors by so many fences and so many walls. This is not a good way to live. We have a crisis of economics and politics, but we have a crisis of community as well. I believe that these problems are inextricably linked. The situations that are creating this work perfectly together to make our lives pretty unhappy in cities. The thing is that if they have similar problems, we might see that they might have similar solutions as well. We have to ask ourselves, what if there was an alternative? What if there was a way to build equity in cities, to have ownership in the places in which we live? What if there was a way to have community in neighborhoods and cities, and we didn't have to choose between these two things? What if we shared? It has a lot of names. It could be co-living, co-sharing, cohabitation, but it comes in a few different models. Our historical kind of conception of this might be like a hippie commune from the 60s, sort of utopian notion. And we laugh at it, but there's actually a lot that we can learn from these models. There's a lot to look at here. The thing is that clearly this type of work is not going to happen in cities. That's not going to happen in New York. It's not going to happen in Boston. So we have to find new 21st century models. And we have places to look for this all over the world. There are communities of people in cities that are trying to figure out a way to make the system work for them. These tend to organize into two categories, top-down and bottom-up. Top-down is actually the model that we're most familiar with. We could describe like a traditional developer as being perhaps top-down. We can also see some experimenting with these new models of living too. Perhaps everyone in this room is familiar with WeLive. It's a subsidiary of WeWork. They're based in cities like Washington, D.C. and New York City, and they offer what we would describe as dormitory plus housing, where people basically pay an amount of money for rent in exchange for not only a place to live, but really beautiful shared spaces. There's shared spaces to work, shared places to eat, and there's neighborhood programming that tries to replicate a sense of being part of a community. There's a few problems with this model, however. It's very expensive, first of all. Tends to only be available for millennials, tends to only be available for people that are singles or couples, definitely not families, not long-term, higher income, and there's no real sense of co-ownership or co-creation here. This doesn't really help us solve the equity problem, and I would argue that it doesn't necessarily help us solve the community problem either. This is a great solution for some people, but we might want to look at some other models that we could describe as being bottom-up. So, what are some examples of those? What does that even mean? We can look at a few different families of models, but one that I want to point to especially is one that we could describe as Baugruppen. This word comes from German, and it's really popular there, and it basically means group build. And here, a developer is not just plotting down a piece of land, telling people what they want, but rather it's a group of people from the community splitting the cost of development and building something themselves. This is pretty radical sometimes. And a project that I want to point to specifically that I had the pleasure of visiting is called Spreefeld. If we take a look at it, it looks pretty normal, right? Pretty beautiful, nice architecture, a lot of green space, places to put your bikes, pretty nice building, right? This is actually how it started. Pretty interesting. So it actually emerged as a protest. The city of Berlin was privatizing the river Spree in an effort to encourage capital development after reunification. The problem is that Berliners had always assumed that the river had a right of public access. This was considered a right for the people living in the city. And they were naturally really upset when they found out that the bulk of it was going to be given away to developers and corporations. So they staged a series of protests and actually started a squat city on a site that they wanted to develop for themselves. While this was definitely guerrilla and extra legal, they ended up actually working with the city to raise the money to buy the site and working with architects to build on it. So when we see these buildings, they're really beautiful, they look normal to us, but they actually function socially, culturally, and in terms of economics exactly the same way as the tent city. There's a real sense of co-creation, a real sense of co-ownership, and a real sense of community. In here, we have opportunities to create spaces that wouldn't be available from private developers who are only interested in the bottom line. We We have beautiful apartments that exist for people at all income levels. And the best part is that it's managed by the community that started it in the first place, looking out for one another, supporting one another, programming the space with their studios, their hopes and dreams. We see it still has its guerrilla-like character, but it also has families living here, old people, young people, everyone. And best of all, public access to the river was maintained and guaranteed. Anyone can enjoy this beachfront, especially in summer. It's packed all the time. Developers were never going to do that. The people had to take this opportunity back and create something for themselves. This is a pretty radical model, and it doesn't always work like this. That's why I want to point to another project too. This is called Urban Big Yard. And unlike the former, where it's kind of like activist urbanite types, this is about as different from that as you can get. This is families with young children. They were tired of living in a city that had no space to offer them, to actually live in the city and raise children while you do it. So a bunch of families got together and they built this project. Every single apartment in the building has enough space to raise a family in. But more importantly, it's designed to be intergenerational. One family that I spoke to has moved in this building 3 separate times. Because there's units designed for couples in their early stage, there's units designed for couples with babies, for couples with small children, and couples with teenagers. This is redefining what it means to be a family, to grow in a building, to feel supported. The amazing thing about these units too is that they navigate the best of what people would want from the suburbs, the best of what they would want from the city. Each unit has its own private roof deck, its own roof garden. There's a sense of actually owning the space that you live in. We might think of this as being sort of similar to a front yard and a backyard in like a suburban house. The difference is that the city lies right beyond. We don't have to choose between the best of the suburbs and the best of the city. In this model, we can have both. This sense of having your own space is mitigated by where it gets its name from, the big yard. The whole building is situated on this giant children's play area. The space is amazing because children from different families can play with one another. They have barbecues here, events, dinners. The space is constantly filled with laughing, smiling, and playing children, and parents watching each other. There's this sense of being in a neighborhood, even though you're in the middle of a big city. It's an amazing space to be in. We don't have to choose. Everyone owns their own place here. And not only do they own it, but they have the sense of belonging, the sense of being uplifted. Speaking of belonging, this model works even for some people that we wouldn't necessarily expect either. I want to introduce you to this group of women who are so inspiring to me. They launched a group that's called the Older Women's Co-Housing Project. There's 26 of them, aged 55 to 88. These women were tired of living in a society that wanted to throw them away. They wanted the second half of their lives to be better than their first. They were tired of being belittled, and they knew that they needed a community of people to rely on and support one another. They didn't want to go into a nursing home. They didn't want to be abandoned by their families. They wanted a space of mutual support, a place to grow old beautifully. And so they built one for themselves. They took their retirement funds and split up the cost of development. Each woman here gets her own apartment, and it's all situated around this beautiful community garden. Each woman has her own parcel, and they also have the community aspect too. And this model is amazing because these women work as one big family. When one of them gets sick, they all go to the hospital to visit her. When one of their arthritis acts up, the other women help her with her parcel in the garden. There's this amazing feeling of belonging, this feeling of connection. And it's only because they were able to do it together. This is an amazing space, redefining what it means to be in a family, what it means to be in a neighborhood. And while so much of this feels pretty radical, many of these ideas are really old. We can look at models like Mirror Commons in California, actually. It's celebrating its 25th year anniversary. This is amazing because we see a whole generation of children growing up in this space. But they're not leaving. They're going away for college, coming back, and we're seeing that they're actually starting families of their own in this very space. We can see that this model might be multi-generational, and that it might be resilient. People are coming back, they want to be here. These spaces can survive for a really long time. We can look at like the kibbutz, the oldest of which are celebrating their 120th anniversary. And we can even point to medieval or indigenous models. Pretty much every culture in America, every culture in the world rather, and in America, has a historical model for what this might look like. This is actually a traditional way of living, one that we've moved away from. A sense of community, of feeling connected with our neighbors. The thing is that we have to get creative about making these models work in the 21st century. We can't just take something old or something that works in a place that has a ton of empty, cheap land and apply it to some of the most expensive, unequal cities on Earth. In order to do that, we have to combine the best of the old, our connection with our Earth, our connection with our neighbors, with the best of the new. We have to think about connective platforms that allow people to communicate with one another more easily and more efficiently than ever before. We need to think about digitized markets that allow land to be distributed in an equitable, cheap, and fair way. We need to think about new models of equity, think about blockchain ownership, about rent to own. We need to think about housing law. This doesn't happen without congressional and government support that actually allows people to do this in a fair and equitable way, especially in an era of discrimination and rent debt. The important thing to keep in mind here, though, is that we have the proof. We know that these models work. We see them working all over the world, as long as the culture is there and the people are passionate about creating this space. We have the proof that they can scale. This is over 1,200 units and families living in it. We have the proof that they can be sustainable. This is fully net zero, an initiative that no developer is going to do on their own. And they're fully equitable, providing spaces for LGBT people to grow old together and redefining what it means to have a chosen family. So we have to ask ourselves, why not? Why can't we build equity in the places where we want to live? Why can't we have community and neighborhood in the cities where we live? Why can't we expand the notion of family to include new models of living, to lean into our chosen families, our chosen communities, our chosen cities, and feel uplifted, supported by each of those things? This is not the way we're living right now. My dream is to build one of these projects in Boston. But more importantly than that, my dream is to revel in the beauty of belonging somewhere, of looking around me and feeling like I'm supported, like I have a place to be, like I have a home. People in cities don't feel like they have homes, and it's my dream to build one for them. I want us all to imagine how much better the system will be when we can lean on one another for mutual support, when we can actually own the spaces in which we live, not just because we paid money, but because it's where we belong. I want us to imagine life built together. Thanks.